Welcome back to Opinion Journal Live. I'm Jason Riley, and my next guest is columnist RiShawn Biddle to talk about education reform. Welcome to the show, RiShawn.
Hey, how's it going, Jason?
I'm good. So this week, the Obama administration issued No Child Left Behind waivers to 8 more states, bringing the total to 19 that can now ignore parts of the federal education law. I know that the law gives the administration the authority to issue these waivers, RiShawn, but some people argue that that the Education Department and Arne Duncan are abusing that authority. What do you think?
Well, I would argue it's an open question. I mean, personally, from my perspective, in all due honesty, what the Obama administration is doing is essentially pulling apart their justification for school reform. One of the key aspects of No Child Left Behind is one of the aspects of the law that the Obama administration is getting rid of is the concept of accountability. That is, schools and states should be accountable for the performance of the students and for the children that taxpayers are paying to educate. One of the amazing things about the accountability rules in No Child, AYP as they call them, is that it really serves a purpose. It actually, for the first time in history, really put a real stamp and really showed how poorly many of our schools are doing. And not just schools that are in the urban communities. We're talking about even in suburban communities where, you have large numbers of poor white students, black students, Latino students, and even middle-class white students who are not doing very well.
Yeah, I agree. The way that No Child Left Behind particularly force school districts to disaggregate the data, break it down by race and gender and so forth, so that schools couldn't hide the fact that only some of their kids were learning, and they would do that by just reporting averages instead of breaking down the data and reporting how these individual demographics are doing. And I agree, it's important that we keep those accountability measures in place. But the argument about these waivers is that they're conditional, RiShawn, that the government can't get these education reforms through Congress. So it's using this waiver authority, but attaching strings to the waivers.
And from my perspective, in all honesty, this is something that should be discussed in the congressional process. There's a lot of reasons why No Child has gone through this issue of being reauthorized. The biggest reason is that on one hand you have Democrats who have to deal with teachers unions who oppose this idea, who oppose the idea of accountability, who oppose the idea of school choice, who oppose the idea of charter schools. And you have, of course, Democrats who support this stuff. And on the other side, you have Republicans who, on one hand, they realize the importance of accountability, but they're also dealing with other side of the party who believes that at the end of the day, the federal government shouldn't be in this business in the first place. Yeah. Now, in an ideal world, I would agree. The federal government shouldn't be in education in an ideal world, but we don't live in an ideal world, and we've already gotten to the point of we spend $100 billion a year on the federal level on education. We just as well make sure that the money is well spent.
Okay, so one of the agenda items that the administration is using these waivers to push is national standards, Common Core standards that it wants for the states, and it argues that the federal government has a role here in making sure that standards are meaningful at some level. Under No Child Left Behind, states could set their own standards. They'd set them low to make their students appear to be learning more than the students actually were, and that the only way to avoid that outcome is for the government, the federal government, to set standards. Do you agree that Washington has a role here, or should this be a state issue?
Well, in my opinion, in an ideal world, this would be a parent issue. Families would actually set the standards because, again, at the end of the day, families, even those families who may not always, they may not always want the best for their children, most of the time, most parents understand and realize that a high-quality education, including strong math, learning about history, learning about American culture, all those things are important. And so they recognize that. But unfortunately, we have created a system where at the end of the day, parents are not allowed to hold schools accountable. They are not able to choose a school based on curriculum or the quality of teaching. They're not given data on how well teachers are doing. And so to a certain extent, Washington ends up playing a role de facto. In fact, with No Child, one of the things about it is that, yes, there were no state standards, but when you talk about the idea of 100% proficiency by 2014, which is illusory, but in many ways it's a high bar that needed to be used to force schools and force states to actually get the job done, or at least attempt to. It's, the federal government is already in this role.
Okay.
Again, ideally, we shouldn't be having this discussion about standards. We should already know what high standards are.